Welcome to the Same Day Podcast, where we discuss driving incremental business growth and other topics related to real estate, property management, and entrepreneurship. Now to the show at hand.
Hey guys, Walter Bowser here. I am the host of today's episode of the Same Day Podcast, where I connect with top business owners and real estate professionals. Today's episode is brought to you by Keyrenter Property Management. At Keyrenter, we are a full-service property management company helping our clients by renovating, operating, and selling real estate assets. We help our clients build wealth by removing the headache of property management. Listen, Jeff, we've helped over 1,000 investors manage their properties from turning non-performing portfolios into performing ones, renovations, or just finding an investment that we can help fit their needs. And that's why no matter what rental you have, single-family home, a bunch of properties in your portfolio, we're the management for you. Jeff, I'm super excited to have you on. This is Jeff with Triton Foundation. Tell me a little bit about yourself, Jeff.
Absolutely. So, Walter, thank you for having me on. I'm super excited about it. We're always happy to help try and spread some awareness and a little bit of information in regards to kind of who we are and what we do. So I've been in construction for most of my life. I've been focused on foundation repair for about the last 20 years. I currently own and operate Triton Foundation Repair based just outside of Oklahoma City in Newcastle. And we are basically a full service foundation repair company. So we have a list of about 19 different services that we offer. And one of the things that we focus on that's different than most other foundation repair companies is we really try and focus on helping people understand how they can prevent from having foundation issues. And we spend a lot of time teaching classes and then also meeting with customers at properties. And we spend a lot of that time teaching people the importance of things like gutters and drainage. So we really take a lot of pride in trying to be educational about this entire process instead of being, we're definitely not sales focused. We're really about education. It kind of is what it is. And when people need you, they need you. And when they don't, they shouldn't fear you. And that's just how we've chosen to run our business all these years. And it works out really well for us. And we're always happy to participate in things like this whenever we can.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I lived that yesterday. I think you came out and did a foundation inspection for us yesterday on our property and ended up saying, hey, it really doesn't need anything from me, which is, something that you don't see often. Typically, I feel like you're getting a sales pitch or whatnot going on. And so I do appreciate that about you guys at Triton. I guess you said you've been doing it for the last 20 years. I guess tell me what motivates you to get into foundation and I guess how did you get started?
Yeah. So I actually had a corporate job just out of college. I used to be a shirt and tie guy. And I parted ways with that company in my early 20s and just kind of went back to our mid 20s. And I went back to the construction industry, which is what I was, pretty well familiar with all the way from a kid, into adulthood. And at the time I owned and operated basically a remodeling company. So I did a lot of handyman services and remodels and kitchens, bathrooms, sheetrock, TRR stuff. I've done business with realtors for, 30 years. And as I got farther into the construction, owning my own business, I learned very quickly that as I approached my 30s, I wasn't nearly as interested in physically doing the work. I wasn't capable of running a company and doing the work. And honestly, I feel like I just kind of burned out on doing that same kind of TRR punch list stuff so often. And I was really interested in learning. I wanted to stay in the foundation, or I wanted to stay in the construction industry, but I wanted to learn something that was unique and different. I'm not a fan of heights, right? So obviously, chimney repair and roofing was out. And I actually just decided to kind of start looking around for a job, and I found a job working as a crew chief for a foundation repair company here in Oklahoma City, and just immediately fell in love with it. It was one of the most difficult, the labor intensive jobs I had ever been around. But as a supervisor, I didn't necessarily have to participate in the labor, but I just immediately enjoyed it, and it was something completely different. There's only a handful of people out there that can tell you that they can lift the corner of a side of the ground. And that is what introduced me to foundation repair. And then from there, it just escalated. And I actually opened and have been operating Triton now for just a little over 9 years. So,
Man, That's awesome. You said something, most people can't do that. It really, buying a home is typically most people's, biggest purchase, right? Like it's their life
100%.
savings or whatever. And I feel like there's relatively little to no, kind of education on foundations and kind of like, what it looks like. And it's really kind of like a scary thought because the foundation is, exactly what you think, the foundation of your home.
Yeah,
I guess, can you kind of go into like the different, foundations? Because there's some that are on a slab, some that are on a crawl
sure,
space, kind of like
sure.
what you've seen and kind of explain the differences.
Yeah, absolutely. So that was honestly a big part of what intrigued me when I first got into foundation repair. Even as early on, like I said, I came out of a suit and tie position. I had management roles. I was an executive, and when I kind of got back into the construction and I found foundation repair, I recognized very quickly that people were terrified. Like people were scared to death of foundation repair. And what I realized very quickly is that the foundation repair companies were using that to their advantage. It was a scare tactic, sales, heavy pressure type of environment. And that was immediately what I recognized the opportunity to be was to eliminate some of that and just be honest and be fair about it. And that was really all I did differently than most other foundation repair companies. So that's part of the reason that we're so heavily focused on education, maintenance, preventive things, drainage, gutters, things like that. But yeah, so in Oklahoma specifically, the most common types of foundations here are going to be typical slab homes, which there are two or three versions of those that most people don't realize. And then there's also the traditional, crawl space houses, which are super common, especially in the more historic parts of Oklahoma or yeah, Oklahoma in general. Uh, we don't have as many basements here as other parts of the country. So I lived in Ohio as a kid. I lived in Michigan. I lived in Pennsylvania, North Carolina. A lot of different parts of the country have basements, and Oklahoma's not a real big basement community. Thank goodness, because basements are terrible in Oklahoma. They're just terrible. It's just not a good fit. The
Is that
clay
because of
soil that we have here.
yeah,
Go ahead.
I was gonna say, is that
Yeah.
because
So
of the soil?
the type of soil that we have in Oklahoma is so different than most other parts of the country. It's much more elastic and expansive than other soils in other parts of the country. So when I teach CE classes, I always ask the people in the class if anybody's lived out of state, and they'll say, "Yeah, I lived in North Carolina, or I lived in Georgia, or I lived in Ohio." And I ask them, Do you know what they have there that we don't have here?" And they're kind of looking at me funny. And the answer is dirt, because we don't have dirt in Oklahoma. We have clay here. It's a completely different ballgame. The way that it drains water, the way that it expands and contracts with moisture content, the way that it responds to the droughts that we have here in the super wet seasons is really, really hard on basements. So I really encourage people, if I personally was going to go back on the market to buy a home to live in, I would never buy a house that has a basement. And I would never buy a house that has a retaining wall on the property. Those are probably the two biggest things in my profession that I would avoid.
Okay, can you explain the retaining wall real quick? I know that's probably a different tangent, but just what makes it
Yeah,
so
for
bad.
sure. So retaining walls are kind of a unique animal. Prior to the last 10 or 12 years, they really weren't like part of the permitting process. They weren't really part of like the engineering process of building a property. So it was very common 20 years ago for builders and developers to just come in and do the basic dirt work, stack up a bunch of railroad ties, and build a house on it. And as those retaining walls deteriorate, they are structurally relevant because that's what's holding up the pad that is holding
Yeah,
up the house. So as the retaining wall fails, the pad starts to deteriorate and the house starts to come down. Um, and because they weren't part of like code or anything like that, they weren't built to really any particular standard. Now, when you go to replace a retaining wall, specifically in places like Oklahoma City or Edmond, you do now have to meet these certain criteria and these engineered specifications. So they're incredibly expensive to replace because you do have to go through the permitting process, the
got it.
pre-engineering, all inspections, all that kind of stuff. And people look at it and they're like, "Oh, I mean, it's a railroad tie retaining wall. Like, how expensive could it possibly be?" You can't go back with that railroad.
That
You
makes
have to go
sense.
back with poured concrete, with an engineered foundation and rebar and the whole 9 yards. So I personally would avoid it just like the plague. And basements kind of fall into that same category. You have to realize that most homes in Oklahoma that were built with a basement typically we're going to see those in like the historic part of Oklahoma City. Like you don't typically see a basement, in the suburbs. So when those basements were built, they were built by the good old boys under very little supervision, with no permits, with no really requirements, no engineers on hand, any of that kind of stuff. And then they built the whole house on top of this basement. So as the basement fails, now that they're 50, 60, 70, 80, 90 years old, as that basement starts to fail, it really creates a lot of structural issues with the rest of the house. And because there's not a lot of basements, there's not a lot of people that work on basements.
Sure.
And we all know that when you're the only guy in the industry, you can charge whatever you want. You know what I mean? So they can get super, super expensive, super fast.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I didn't even, think about that. But when you are in Oklahoma, you don't see basements unless you're exactly right, older. Now, talk to me, I guess, a little bit about the crawl spaces. You guys fixed a crawl space of ours on Northwest 12th Street, I think, last year at some point.
Sure.
You did it really quick, and it was not as expensive as I thought. Especially when we got that. I guess tell me, like, what are the most items you see in a crawl space and how they differentiate from a like normal slab foundation?
So when it comes to a crawl space, there's definitely positives and negatives. One of the more obvious advantages of a crawl space is that you have access to things like your heat and air ducts and your plumbing, right? Whereas in a slab, those things may be underneath the house and you wouldn't have access to them. So that might be considered a positive. The downside of them is that those things are now exposed, and you have to deal with animals, and you have to deal with deterioration, and you have to deal with water in the crawl space and all those kinds of things. So that it's really just a matter of preference. Personally, I don't care for crawl space houses. I don't like the odor. I don't like the cold floors in the wintertime. But when it comes to a foundation repair company and how we relate to crawl space houses, it's a little bit more specific than what most people think. When you need repairs in a crawl space house from us, that usually means that you need something lifted, right?
Sure.
Like, that means that we're just picking up something heavy. And essentially that's what we do for a living, is pick up heavy stuff. So what we oftentimes see is we see support systems and we see old beams and things like that have deteriorated or they have warped. More often than not, they were built again by the good old boys back in, the day. And it was, the uncle and a nephew on a Saturday that did it. They didn't really build those support systems inside of the crawl space to hold the house up. They built those to hold the piece of material in place so that they could build the house.
Interesting.
So that's why a lot of times you see like a cinder block and 3 bricks and a piece of wood and a roofing shingle. Like, they were just hodgepodging stuff together to really just hold that beam in place so that they could build the rest of the house. A lot of those supports underneath that house were not necessarily intended to be structural components. So when we go in, more often than not, what we're doing is we're replacing some type of inadequate structural component with something that's intentional. And then we're using those to physically lift the floor back as close to original as possible. And it's a relatively quick process. It's brutal. I mean, anytime you're doing something on your belly with your face in the dirt and 8 inches of crawl space, like, it's a really, really hard job to do. But it doesn't get any better by slowing it down.
Sure.
So,
Yeah.
you know what I mean? Like, once you're under there, man, you might as well just get after it. And because the faster you get done, the faster you get out.
Yeah, absolutely.
So we see a lot of those kind of situations, not as much now, obviously, as we did back then with real estate, progressing the way that it has. And a lot of those houses have kind of been bought up and flipped and remodeled and all that kind of stuff. But more often than not, one of the things that people don't realize about foundation repair, when you start to have issues, it can be relatively inexpensive to fix. But because people are afraid of the foundation repair industry as a whole, they put their blinders on, they ignore it, they don't touch it, they don't deal with it. And then when life happens and you need to sell that property, it has deteriorated for the last 15 years. So instead of needing 4 pad piers crawl space or 5 steel piers, now all of a sudden you need 19 pad piers in the crawl space and you need 12 steel piers on the house. And then the price tag is really what kind of throws people off. When in all actuality, had they dealt with it when it started, that would have eliminated that failure, and that would have been the end of it. Not to mention everything was cheaper 15 years ago than it is now anyway. You know what I mean? So
Yeah.
big opportunity for saving by getting to that stuff sooner, instead of just kind of putting your blinders on and letting it deteriorate.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that brings me to another point that I wanted to ask you about is, you said if you see it early on, or if you, kind of notice those foundation, changes or whatnot, tell me, what are early signs of foundation? I could walk around the house and see cracks in the brick, or, but what are you looking for when you're looking at for these, early foundation issues?
So it's first off, it's important to understand that foundation repair is it's not a science, it's an art. Okay. And I tell people when I teach classes that if you were to take one single property, let's say the house that you and I looked at together yesterday, if you brought in 5 different foundation repair companies, all 5 guys are going to have a different idea, because they all 5 have different motives, and they all 5 have different like pay structures and incentive programs. So you're not going to get the same information from every person. If you were to bring in 5 structural engineers to the house that you and I looked at yesterday, you would still get 5 different sets of opinions.
Interesting.
So it's important to understand that who you're talking to, who you're dealing with, and what their motives are as important to the project and the property as the work itself. I always feel like we kind of need to get that up front, because there's always a lot of disagreement. But again, if you see 3 different engineer reports, they don't agree either, right?
Yeah.
So when it comes to what repairs are needed, when they're needed, and why, everybody might have a little different sense of opinion, right? So I have one engineer that we have a really good relationship with, and he tells people that if you can put a nickel in the crack in the brick, it's worth having evaluated.
Okay.
So that thickness, if the crack in the brick is the thickness of a nickel, it's worth having it checked. That doesn't necessarily mean that it's broken or that it's wrong, but it's worth having it checked. Where people go wrong is they don't know who to call. And if they call a pier salesman, the pier salesman is going to scare them into buying piers because there's a crack in their house. And what easier target is there than a scared person with a crack in their house, right?
100%.
The reality is that not everything that has a crack needs to be piered. And also, not everything that we pier is cracked. Like, that's just not the way it works. So long story short, to answer your question, what we're looking for is multiple things in the same area that just shouldn't be there. Okay. So if we find a crack in the brick, that's one. If we find a displaced or dislodged freeze board in that same area, that would be 2.
Gotcha.
If we go inside and we find a crack in the sheetrock or a closet door that won't open, that's 3 indicators of movement, because none of those 3 things should exist all in a confined area. That's enough, in our opinion, to justify lifting and or stabilizing that spot. So what you're looking for is things that are there that shouldn't be. Cracked flooring tiles, doors that don't work properly, gaps between the window frame and the brick, gaps between the brick and the door frame, dislodged freeze boards, gaps in baseboards is a big one. People don't realize how important baseboards are on the inside of their house. If you have an exterior wall baseboard that lines up to an interior wall baseboard, and those 2 are not touching anymore, that's usually because the outside wall has rolled away, right? Yeah. There's probably 15 or 20 things that you could be looking for. The trick, and what we train our evaluators to do, is to identify multiple of those things kind of in that same little area. And then you kind of work that area down until you quit finding things. And that kind of gives you an idea of what part of the house needs to be piered. Because if you get down a 65-foot wall and that last bedroom doesn't have any indicators on it, you shouldn't pier that. Like, you should pier the area of influence or the area that has an issue, but you shouldn't just be peering past that just for grins. So anyway, I think that answers your question.
100%.
I get a little windy.
No, I appreciate that. It's a lot of education. So another thing that you keep saying that just pops off to me is the kind of scare tactic of it. And I feel like, that's really real. I've done a ton of transactions, and a
100%.
lot of them have always seemed, with the foundation issue, seem to bust, right? Like the
Oh
sale of
yeah.
the home might
Oh
not go
yeah.
through or whatnot because of foundation issue. Can you kind of talk to me about, like, I guess, like, if you have some common myths that people bring up often, or
Yeah.
something that
Oh,
people get
that's a
scared about, so I
fantastic
can.
question. That's a fantastic question. So let me preface it by saying a couple of things. When I first started in the foundation repair business, again, because of the background that I had in kind of a corporate environment, I'm pretty keen on walking into a room and identifying kind of who's who and what their job is. You know what I mean? Like, you just kind of get a feel for their aura.
Sure.
I recognized very quickly that there was a few things about the salesmen at this company that really stood out to me. For one, they hardly ever wore logoed shirts, which I found very unusual. They also drove their own vehicles, which I found highly unusual. They also used their own personal cell phones, which I found to be extremely interesting. They also didn't have set office hours. And I thought, well, that seems really weird. Well, when you're a foundation repair company and you're hiring salesmen, you pay them commission only. So you don't supply them with any of the things that they need. All you supply them with are leads, and that's what they call them, is leads. You supply them with leads, and their job is to go out and hunt, and they only eat what they kill. Okay. So I found that super, super interesting from the very beginning. And those guys, because they're not necessarily connected to the company culture, and there's not necessarily a sense of camaraderie or loyalty with realtors and things like that. They don't care if they bust your deal.
Sure.
As far as they're concerned, every 30 peer bid they toss out, eventually one of them is going to buy it. And they're just waiting on that one to buy it. And they could care less if they bust your deal in the process. So instead of coming to your evaluation on a house that's in transaction and telling you, hey man, this house needs 4 peers, which is a perfectly normal average job,
Sure.
there wasn't a whole lot of incentive for them to do that. It was, to them, it made more sense based on their pay structure for them to come at you for $25,000 worth of work and then hope that it worked out. Right.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah.
So that was one of the biggest adjustments and changes that we made right out of the gate, is that we don't hire salesmen. If you talk to my evaluators as you meet them, you'll see that one of them used to work as a crew chief for a utility company. Another one was a professional welder. I've got one that was a warehouse manager for a big box store. Like, I don't hire salesmen because that's not what I want, and that's not who I want to be around, and that's not who I want around my customers. So having some sort of understanding of what people's incentives are definitely comes into play, because the biggest myth of foundation repair of them all is that this costs $30, $40, $50, $60, $70,000.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Triton Foundation Repair is one of the largest foundation repair companies in the state of Oklahoma. I can probably count on one hand how many residential projects. Now, I'm not talking about apartment complexes. I'm not talking about multifamilies. I'm not talking about commercial industrial. I'm talking about regular old single family households. We work on probably 3,000 houses a year.
Sure.
We've probably done 5 of those that were bigger than $50,000.
Yeah. That's incredible. Yeah.
Right. So the odds that you happen to live in a house that needs $50,000 worth of foundation repair is way more likely due to the salesman than it is to your house. So it's important that people understand that statistically, the likelihood, if somebody shows up and they tell you, hey man, you need 50 grand worth of work on your house, you should know that, because your house should be a wreck. You know what I mean? That shouldn't be oh, by the way, that should be your house is a wreck, right?
Yeah.
So the biggest myth, like I said, is that it's common for $30, $40, $50, $60,000 proposals. It's incredibly uncommon in the real world that happen. I get probably 15 to 20 structural engineer reports, not our evaluations, but third-party structural engineer reports. I get 15 to 20 of those through my office a week.
Okay.
I bet you we don't see 10 of those a year that have $50,000 worth of work on them. Like, that's how uncommon it really is.
Wow.
Right?
Yeah, that's insane.
It's crazy. So the average residential foundation repair project is I used to tell people it was $3,500, but then COVID hit, prices, blah, blah, blah. I bet if you took every job that we work on and you figured it up by the average, I bet it's $5,000.
Wow.
Like
Yeah.
most of them are just not that big a deal. It's very home maintenance level. 90% of the time we get it done in one day. It's not usually this big, massive event. And you have to remember that the foundation repair companies have established this deep-rooted sense of fear. So when they show up to your house, you're already expecting it to be ridiculous. So when they tell you 40 grand, you're not shocked. But the reality is that they've been setting you up for years to have that type of fear. A quick story, and then I'll give you your mic back. I did an evaluation on Thursday of last week. I showed up and met the seller, which I don't usually meet the sellers. I usually meet the buyers. I met the seller. The buyer's realtor was also there. I do a full evaluation of this house, $900,000 home, beautiful home in Edmond, super nice people. And I'm like, hey man, look, and he shows me the inspection report. He's like, hey man, here's the inspection report from when I bought it 4 years ago. That crack was there. This gap was here. Like, and I'm like, I get it. Like, I get it. The problem is that it needs to be fixed. And it's going to take 5 piers to pier that corner. Here's why this happened. Here's how you can prevent it on your next house. And the guy was upset. The guy was mad. And I told him, I said, listen, all I did was come over here and give you my opinion. If you don't like my opinion, you're welcome to call a structural engineer. I said, but I would be willing to bet you the cost of this job that the structural engineer is going to tell you 5 piers the same way I'm telling you 5 piers, because that's how we do this. And he said, speaking of the price, how much is it? And I said, it's $3,200. And he said, what? And I said, it's $3,200. And he said, total. And I said, total, tax, labor, material, warranty, everything, $3,200. I said, how much did you think I was going to tell you? And he said, Jeff, I thought you were going to tell me it was $32,000. He said, I thought you were going to add a zero to that. He said, if all we're talking about is $3,200, I don't care. Put the piers in and let's move on, right? That's how it should be. That's how it's supposed to work. But for whatever reason, that individual was under the impression in his own mind that this was going to be a massive undertaking, and it's just not. It's just not.
Yeah,
So,
100%. I think I hear that all the time. And honestly, you guys do have really great pricings. I think if you do go to a different, foundation company, it may have that extra zero on there. And that's probably why he was so
some of them,
concerned.
there's some of them that do.
I guess now flip it from the, I guess, cost of it myth wise, but let's say like the uncertainty myth. I feel like that's a huge myth out there. It's like, hey, I'm going to buy this house that has foundation issues. It's going to have issues from here on out, right? Which is probably the same if you go and buy another house. It could have the same possibility of having foundation issues, right? It doesn't really
Okay.
probably dictate that. But tell me, because I feel like if a buyer is going to look at that property and it has foundation issues, immediately once that comes up, the buyer starts, putting one foot out and saying like, hey, I'm uneasy about this.
100%.
Tell me
100%.
kind of what your, I guess, thought is on that of buying a home with issues already prevalent, or if they're fixed correctly, or I guess.
So another really, really good question. And I appreciate that you spent some time on this, because a lot of people have me on these things and they just ask like normal questions. These are really good questions. So again, let me preface it with this. Triton as a company, one foundation repair company in Oklahoma City, we will evaluate 8,000 plus homes this calendar year.
I believe it.
So Triton will evaluate over 8,000 properties in a single business year. Okay. 30% of the houses that we look at don't need anything. They just don't. They're fine. Maybe we tell them put gutter on it. Maybe we tell them do some dirt work around your house. Maybe improve the drainage. The reality is that we work on, again, thousands of houses a year. Most people don't realize this, but if you there's not a database somewhere that categorizes and catalogs all this information, because it all just belongs to that one individual property. The fact of the matter is that if you took every residential property inside of Oklahoma City's city limits, I would dare to say that probably 65% of them have had pier work done at some point.
No, I believe that. I was
super common,
yeah.
Right? Super common. We see houses every single day when we're there to evaluate it, and we're there with the buyer, we're there with the buyer's realtor, the buyer's dad is keeping an eye on what we're doing. You know what I mean? And we're like, hey man, that's a breakout right there. Like there's a pier right there. And they're like, what? I'm like, yeah, that's a pier. That's what that patch is in the concrete. They're like, I had no idea. The seller is like, I've had no idea that patch was there when I bought the house. And I'm like, this house has been piered before. People just don't know it. It's so common. So when you talk about a house that has $6,000, $8,000, $10,000 worth of foundation repair, perfectly normal, not a huge deal. It kind of is what it is. The challenge is when you get into a house, when you go to a house and they say, well, this house has 40 piers under it. I'm not going to buy a house that has 40 piers under it. Like, I'm not going to do that. And the reason why is because it's one of two things. Either one, the dirt work was done horrifically, or the general construction of the property was done horrifically, which is not a good indicator that it's a really good house. And you can't control either of those things anyway. So you're really rolling the dice, unless they're giving the house away. Like, you're really rolling the dice. The other thing is that most houses in Oklahoma that have 40 piers under them, they only needed 10.
Okay. So
the pier guy,
can you over
the pier guy sold the other 30 because he needed to put his kid in private school, right? Now, when you pier things that shouldn't be piered, or you move things that shouldn't be moved, you can be causing problems.
Gotcha.
Okay. So there's not a right answer. Some situations dictate 15 piers and some situations dictate 3. Some houses are perfectly fine with 12 piers. An 800 square foot house from 1974 in a crawl space that has 18 piers around it, man, that's a problem. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So every situation is a little bit different. And I tell you that to tell you this. Knowing who you're talking to, and again, what their motives are in regards to that conversation, everything boils down to that. It all boils down to that. Because any used car sales ex-professional turned peer salesman can make a situation seem like something that it's not, if that's in their best interest. But that's not always the truth. You know what I mean? Like, and it is what it is. So anyway, that's kind of my take.
So you wouldn't say it's like, hey, if you're buying this property and the foundation was fixed correctly, let's say they put 4 piers in there that need 4 piers, you wouldn't have reservations of saying like, hey, it's still a good home, go for it, you know, service you and
no way. It wouldn't bother me a bit. Wouldn't bother me a bit. Now, as a buyer of a home that has had foundation repair on it, I know what questions to ask. So let's talk about that for just a split second.
Yeah, please do. Yeah.
For one, I want a copy of the diagram that shows exactly what work was done and exactly where that work was done. And any reputable foundation repair company should have that on file. Okay. When I call to ask for that information, that conversation and that interaction is going to give me a really good idea of what kind of company I'm dealing with. If I call them and I say, hey man, I'm interested in buying this house at XYZ. I understand that y'all did the paperwork. I need a copy of that paperwork. If it's in my inbox by the end of that day, I have a pretty decent understanding of the kind of company that is.
Sure.
But if I have to fight tooth and nail for 2 weeks to get them to email me a piece of paper, what's going to happen when I want them to come do a warranty adjustment on this pier work that they promised the seller when they sold it? Okay. So I want the diagram up front. I want a copy of the paperwork. I want a copy of their warranty, because what a lot of people don't realize when it comes to property transactions is that most foundation repair companies' warranties belong to the owner of the property. So if I do work for Mr. and Mrs. Smith on XYZ property, and they turn around and they sell it to Walter Bowser 3 months later, their contract might say that you only have 30 days for you to step in and assume my warranty.
Got it.
Which means you as the buyer might need to send me a certified letter. You might need to make a personal appearance to the office. You might need to send an email. You might need to verify the purchase of the property. You might need to pay a transfer fee of $800. Okay. That documentation is also going to say, if you don't put if there's not gutters on the house, we're going to void your warranty completely. If you have a drainage problem in your yard, we're going to void your warranty completely. So I'm going to track down all of that information, because having the piers is one thing. Knowing that a house has 4 piers on it is one thing. but I also want to determine the validity of the warranty itself and what kind of company I'm going to be dealing with when it comes to that warranty. Or is the company out of business?
Oh, yeah, or is the company out of
So,
business? Yeah, it's good.
right. So there's been, I've kind of lost track over the years. In the last like 6 or 7 years, there's probably been 8 foundation repair companies in central Oklahoma that have completely shut down and gone out of business. Well, the warranty that they apply to those peers when they do that work on your house, it's a lifetime warranty, but whose life?
Exactly, the LLC
Right?
or the
Like
company.
who
Yeah.
needs to be breathing for this thing to work? So if somebody, unfortunately passes away, or if they get divorced, or whatever the case may be, if their business closes down, that warranty's gone. Well, even me in the position I'm in, there are 1 or 2 companies that have gone out of business that if I was going to buy a house and I knew it had a handful of peers on it, if I knew it was their peers, I probably wouldn't worry a whole lot about it. But if it's that other guy's peers, I got a big problem with that, because I knew how he did business and I knew how he operated. Therefore, I don't trust the work that they did. Right. So if there's a lot of moving parts. I really encourage people like property management companies and real estate agents to really learn the appropriate questions to ask when it comes to that part of the process, because it's not as simple as closing on the house and now you own the warranty. That's not how this works. They have loopholes in their documentation that will void the warranty if you don't meet your obligations. And I can't tell you how many times that we come across people and they're like, so-and-so peered the house, but I don't want to deal with them because I bought the house and 4 months later I had a problem and they told me they voided the warranty, so I'm not having them come back out. It's like, well, it's not their responsibility to tell you what the warranty, stipulations are. So you have to know what questions to ask.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I guess now I'm going to flip it on you. What's your policy at Triton? Is it they have to write a certified letter, or is
I guess I was going to mention that.
it?
So yeah, salesmanship. So the way I'm kind of an idiot, like if I'm being honest, right? And I'm also not a paperwork fan. So when I started Triton, my warranty belongs to the property address. It doesn't belong to anybody. So I don't care who owns the house. The warranty lives where the work was done.
Sure.
I don't think the name on the mail should matter, right? Like if I'm doing a quality job and I'm willing to put my reputation and my brand on the line with a lifetime warranty, why do I care who lives at that house? Like it makes no difference. The warranty that we offer belongs to the property. There is no transfer. You don't have to turn in any paperwork. There's no letters, no emails, no certifieds, no transfer fee. There's no fee. Because I don't care about that kind of stuff. I don't want to make $200 off of every customer because they had to transfer the fee during one of the most like emotionally and financially difficult times in their lives, right? Which is the part,
Absolutely.
which is the buying process.
Yeah.
So yeah, we don't mess with any of that stuff. Now, we do have some similarities when it comes to other foundation repair companies. If we peer an area of your home and we tell you and document like the reason this failed is because you have miserable drainage, or you don't have gutters, or you have your downspouts or whatever. If we tell you those things and you don't fix those things, theoretically we have the opportunity to void your warranty.
100%. That makes sense.
But that's not how we make a living. We don't make a living off of killing people's warranties. We tend to go back and go, look, man, like I told you need to put gutters on the house. Put the gutters on the house. I'm going to make one adjustment for free, and then we'll call it even. And they're like, okay, you know what I mean?
I love that.
It's not a huge deal.
Yeah, no, you keep saying it, and I want to touch on it just because I can't tell you how many people from out-of-state investors that come in and they buy these houses, especially new built houses that don't come with gutters, right? And I'm like, hey, you've got to put gutters on this, and then it's like
100%.
what, like $1,800, $2,000, somewhere in there. Usually, it's not expensive at all. But I mean, it's such a battle sometimes, and I feel like if they just hear from you, like, hey, gutters are important. Let me just ask you, how important are gutters?
They're vital. They're absolutely vital. And I mentioned earlier that I've lived all over the country. And most of the places that I've ever lived, including just visiting, I was in Indiana visiting my brother last winter. And I was in Indiana for 4 days. And because I'm a foundation nerd, you know what I mean? Like, what do I look at when I go to a new city? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I did not see one single residential property in 4 days of being in Indianapolis that did not have full wrap gutter systems, right? We were in Orange Beach, Alabama for my daughter's cheer competition last summer. Same thing. 5 days down there. Didn't see a single house that didn't have gutters everywhere. But for some reason, you come to Oklahoma and about 1 in 8 houses actually has a gutter system. And I'm like, why is the mentality so different in Oklahoma than it is in almost every other part of the country when it comes to gutters? But then people in Oklahoma are like, why is foundation repair so expensive? And it's like, well, I mean, the gutter guy's not, you know what I mean? Like, the gutter guy's
exactly.
a cheap date, dude. Hang out with that guy for a day. Let him $2,500 you. $2,500, you can get a lot of gutter on your house.
100%.
Gutters are considered, in my opinion, I guess real estate professionals may not necessarily agree, but in my opinion, gutters are considered a property improvement.
Yes.
So they're adding to. Well, foundation repair is not. Foundation repair is maintenance. There's no value add by putting piers underneath the house. So if you gutter it on the front end, and it means that you either don't need piers or you don't need as many piers in the long term, you're way money ahead. But I've done TV commercials, social media, paid sponsored ads. I mean, you name it. We scream it from the mountaintops, brother. And there's no more gutters on these houses now than there was 20 years ago when I started screaming, dude. So it kind of is what it is. You know what I mean? People just won't do it.
They just won't do it. I can never, for whatever reason, I guess my sales pitch is never good enough to investors. I'm like, hey, you've got to put gutters on this, and they just
won't do it.
Yeah, won't do it.
They won't do it. And the home inspectors tell them to do it. Their dads tell them to do it. The appraiser tells them to do it. We tell them to do it. And then they don't. You tell them to do it, and then they don't do it. And it's like, okay, man, you need 9 piers on your house.
Exactly
You know
right.
what I mean?
Especially with some of these newer built homes. I mean, it's amazing, man. It's really amazing. There's one builder in particular in Oklahoma City. I'm sure you know. I won't name it, but like, you have about 5 years with this builder, and if you don't have gutters on that, then you have way less than that, and then you're gonna need foundation work on it. And so it's almost insane sometimes. I'm like, hey, it's really, really, really worth it. I can, show you multiple properties that we've done this on, like everything like that. So, I guess real quick, just to kind of like wrap stuff up, because I know I'm taking a lot of your time. What, if there is any, which there might not be any, but it seems like another one of these myths maybe around foundations is like, what impact does it have on the home if there's been foundation, like financial, like does it improve? Like you said, it doesn't improve the value. It's maintenance on the home.
Yeah, there's no value.
Does it reduce the value if you do piers or anything like that?
No, that question would probably be better suited for an appraiser, because I can't speak to there. But in my experience, I have literally never one time ever had a customer come back to me and say, "Hey, man, I can't get this price for my house because it's got piers under it." Like, does it lessen your buyer's pool? Probably.
Yeah.
Does it make the realtor's job a little bit more difficult because they have to navigate the fact that it has had pier work? Probably, but it doesn't change the actual value of the house. The foundation failed. You fixed it. It should be covered under warranty, and that should pretty much be the end of it. Now, if your buyer pool consists of investors from California, that's a completely different conversation than if your buyer pool is a family that grew up in Norman. Right, like
100%.
You're going to lose that California guy on pier work almost every single time. The lady that grew up in Ada or Enid or Norman, like whatever, they don't. You know what I mean? They don't care. So does it change the dynamic a little bit? Yes. Does it change the value? No, it doesn't. It just doesn't. Even houses. I told you earlier that we find a lot of pier work. Installing piers, we find piers that people didn't know even existed.
100%.
There's millions of them. There's a lot of houses that have them. There's millions of piers that have been installed that nobody knows about. Even properties where the foundation repair company went out of business, the piers still exist. And to a certain extent, you have to give them the benefit of the doubt until you can prove that there's a problem. So the value of the house is the value of the house based on what somebody's willing to give you for it. And buying a house that has piers from a company that's out of business, is that risky? Am I going to try and negotiate the price of the house down? Of course I am. You know what I mean? Like, it's an opportunity, so I'm not going to step over it and move on. But at the end of the day, if you buy that house and it has piers from a company that went out of business, you're kind of right back to where you started anyway. Somebody's going to have to spend $5 or $10 grand to get it fixed. kind of is what it is. I just hope you bought it right. You know what I mean?
100%. That's a really good way to put it is, if it needs to be fixed, it's gonna be fixed. And like you said, you don't give a lifetime warranty for something that you don't expect to work, right? So like
I don't.
yeah,
I
yeah,
don't.
yeah,
Right.
yeah.
But I mean, there's a lot of pier companies out there that were selling concrete pilings, for example, which are completely different than steel piers. They've been selling concrete pilings in Oklahoma City for 20 years. There's been a lot of guys that have come in, offered concrete pilings at a bottom dollar cheapo discount rate, offered lifetime warranties, and then 5 years later they close their business down, and all of those piers fail, and all of those people have to start over. And we pier those houses all the time because people literally have to start over because the guy went out of business. So yeah, like theoretically, now when you talk about companies that are genuinely well known, that have a history and a background in the state of Oklahoma, and when you think about those companies, like there's three of them that come across your mind, right? Those three companies, they've been around forever because they do quality work and they use quality pier systems. Now, those three companies are not necessarily the same three companies that spend the most money on TV commercials.
Sure. Yeah.
They're not necessarily the company that spends the most money on billboards, but those three companies have really been along for the ride for a really long time in Oklahoma. And I'm super proud to say that Triton is kind of the fourth of that group because we've really kind of put some time and some effort and some experience under our belt. But I would tell you, I run TV commercials from time to time. I do a little bit of advertising and some marketing and some social media stuff. But when you see somebody that's just inundating the market, that's a lot of money they're spending. That's a lot of budget that they're dedicating towards that. Those typically are not the companies that always do the best job because they're so focused on generating new leads that the back end tends to. And anyway, I probably shouldn't go far.
No, I agree with you because I think, and that's how I heard of Triton when we first started using was word of mouth. It wasn't even a TV commercial or
Right.
literally anything like that. It was word of mouth. And when you hear something word of mouth, it's typically a good thing.
Yeah. 100%. 100%.
I mean, it's really amazing that you have all this knowledge on it. And now I gotta ask you one more question because you brought it up.
Sure.
Tell me real quick, just because I've never used nor heard of the concrete ones. Tell me just the difference between that and the steel pier that I know about and that we've used before.
Okay, perfect. I can do that. So, this is about the size of a monster can. This little Wi-Fi radio. Okay.
Yeah.
This is an ink pen. So, when we put in steel piers, they're literally about that diameter. Okay, that's how big the diameter is of a steel pier. That's relatively small, and it's just pipe. So when we push it in the ground, these piers are literally intended to pierce the ground. They're supposed to go through the ground because we're trying to get the pier down in the ground far enough that it actually makes contact with some type of, everybody calls it bedrock, but it's not hardly ever bedrock. Some kind of strata or load-bearing soil or something underground that will hold the weight, okay? So these are intended to actually pierce through the ground. Concrete pilings are the opposite. Concrete pilings are 6 inches in diameter. They're concrete cylinders that are 12 inches long. So they are literally 5 times that size.
Got it.
They are hydraulically pressed into the ground the same way a steel pier is, except instead of going to the bottom and hitting something, they're more designed to create a massive pressure bubble in the ground as you force this big piece of material in the ground, right? So when I teach my CE classes, I hold up a monster can because I always have one in the CE classes, and I hold up an ink pen. And I tell them, okay, if we went out in the front yard, if we were to stand on this ink pen, most of us could push this into the ground, barring, age and balance. Most of us could kind of push this into the ground. Nobody is going to stand on this and push it into the ground. If I put a Suburban on top of your head and you stood on this, you still would not get this to push in the ground.
It would flatten out, right?
It would flatten out. So when concrete cylinders are pushed in the ground, they create this massive pressure bubble, and they also create what's called skin friction, which is the force of the ground making contact with the sides.
Got it.
And it will build up a large enough pressure bubble that you can theoretically lift a house with it. I mean, we're talking tens of thousands of pounds. We're talking a lot of weight. It will build up enough pressure that you can lift a house with it. The difference between a steel pier that sits on some type of load-bearing strata is when the house is sitting on top of it, there's nowhere for it to go. Okay. A concrete piling that's pushed in the ground with this massive pressure bubble, over the next 5 years, when that pressure bubble dissipates back into the earth and it goes away, this is just concrete garbage underneath your house.
That makes sense. Yeah.
So
Okay,
the failure rate, and they don't call them concrete pilings, but that's what they're called. They're actually called concrete pilings. They call them concrete piers because it sounds better. But if they're pushing concrete in the ground, it's not the same thing as a steel pier. Engineers, structural engineers, will not let their homeowners or clients use concrete pilings. Engineers will only allow steel and sign off on steel piers. Well, if the structural engineer who has no skin in the game when it comes to the warranty, if he won't sign off on a concrete piling, I don't care what that salesman tells you. You know what I mean? Like, come on.
Yeah, yeah.
Steel piers are the only long-term actual repair when it comes to Oklahoma. Concrete pilings might work in certain parts of the country, but they just don't work in Oklahoma. A little while ago, I told you about the 6 foundation repair companies that went out of business in the last 6 or 7 years. 5 of them were using concrete pilings. Like, that's not a coincidence. So when those companies go out, all of those concrete pilings that they had installed during their lifespan, all of those warranties are completely invalid, and nobody will come in after the fact and work on a concrete piling that somebody else installed. So your only option, if that company goes out of business, is to start completely over. Well, now obviously you would go with steel piers because you learned your lesson. So that's not really a cheap way to go around it. You know what I mean? That's a pretty expensive lesson.
Yeah, that is a super expensive lesson.
You save $1,000 up front on 5 piers, you save $1,000. And in 5 years later, you got to spend, $7,000 to have it all redone. You're not really going anywhere. Not to mention the hassle of dealing with it twice. Nobody wants to hang out with us, much less twice. You know what I mean?
There we go. Yeah.
So,
That's hilarious. Well, I guess, final question for you. And thank you so much for answering all this and really shedding some light into the foundation stuff. Just a piece of advice. Like I know that you probably are a wealth of advice for homeowners and people that are dealing with foundation issues, but if you could say like the most common thing, hey, this is the best piece of advice I can give you. What would you say would be?
Man, it sounds kind of dumb. But look at your house. Like, just stop what you're doing and go outside and look at your house. I bet you, Walter, the next time you're at the golf course and you're hanging out with your buddies, ask them to describe to you the color of the brick that their house is made with. Just ask them to describe it to you. I bet half of them can't do it. Okay. People don't actually genuinely stop and look at their house. They walk by it, they drive up to it, they walk into it, they sleeve the door. So people that actually go outside and actually physically, consciously stand there and just look at their house for a couple of minutes, they tend to be the people that find an issue here and there. They're always the people that stay ahead of it. They're the people that get 2 piers or 3. The people that everybody has what we call a blind side of their house. One side of your house is where the trash cans are, which is where the gate is that goes in your backyard, right? The other side of your house is what we call the blind side. When was the last time you were on the blind side of your house? Right?
I couldn't even tell you mine. Yeah, never.
Right, never. And when you are over there, you're mowing or you're weed eating, so you're looking down. You're not looking at the house, right? So when all of the news channels started advertising or started blaring all this information about earthquakes, and then everybody was hair on fire about earthquakes, 99% of the earthquake damage that we found was on the blind side of people's house where they never go.
Yeah, I was already there.
Because that damage had been over there for 3 years. They just never stopped and looked at it. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So stop and look at it. That would probably be first and foremost. Secondary would be absolutely put gutters all the way around your house. Put downspout extensions on every one of your downspouts to get the water as far away from your house as you possibly can. Go outside during a rain and figure out where's the water coming from, where is the water going to, is it standing next to my foundation, is it running down next to my house, or is it evacuating away so that you can do dirt work and drainage and things like that. And I mean, Probably the last one to round up the 4, even though you asked for one, would probably be to just be conscious of what's going on with your house. Don't be afraid to touch stuff up, but try to document. Like, when is the last time you painted the inside of your house? 2021. That's a lot different answer than, I don't know. How long has this door not worked? I don't know. How long has that crack been in the brick? I don't know. Right? Like, you're not giving the peer guy a whole lot to work with. So if you can answer those questions with a little bit of actual factual information, we don't want you to lie to us because that's not helpful. But if you can answer questions with factual information, a lot of times that's the difference between, if we don't know and we don't have any information, especially if the house is under contract, we kind of have to peer it because we need to protect the buyer, right?
Yeah.
But if you come to me and you're like, no way, dude, look, I fixed this door in May of 23. I had the home inspection report in 2021 when I bought it. I put this flooring down in April of 17. Like, if you have factual information, it's like, cool, that was there. This is fine. Don't worry about that. Not a big deal. You can actually kind of work your way through that process. But people have a tendency to do the opposite. And they feel like the more information they're going to give us, the more we're going to like weaponize it. And the reality is it's completely opposite, because if you don't give me information to work on, now my main responsibility is to protect the buyer, and protecting the buyer equals peers.
Yeah. That's probably
a really big one too.
Yeah. I mean, I feel like everything you said is just have like house common sense, like home ownership common sense, right? Like take a look at
but
it.
People don't think about this stuff. You know what I mean? People don't think about this, and they don't, people don't watch Foundation Repair podcast. You know what I mean? Like, people don't, and they just don't. It's not something that's front of mind. And then when somebody does need to sell their house, all this information comes rushing in. And by then it's like, it's too late. It's like, dang it.
Too little, too late. I agree with that.
Anyway, those are my few.
No, I appreciate it. Those are all really good. I mean, it actually makes me think, when's the last time I walked around my own house, or on my investment properties? Easy. I do it all the time, but like on my own house, never.
On your own house? Yeah, right.
Yeah, never.
I could, my son's bedroom is at the opposite. I happen to be home this afternoon, but I mean, my son's bedroom is on the far end of the house over here. I couldn't tell you the last time. I mean, I honestly couldn't. I couldn't tell you the last time I stopped and looked at his window trim, to just see where everything was.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, it's a really good piece. Yeah. Well, we've been talking to Jeff, who is the founder and owner of Triton Foundation. I really appreciate like everything that you've given us and the hour of your time. I appreciate that. I'm going to put your website in the comments and your social media and all that stuff, so that way they know where to find you. I really appreciate it, and hopefully we'll talk again soon.
Absolutely. Sounds great. Walter, thanks for having me, and I appreciate your time.
Yeah, thanks, Jeff.
Bye, buddy.
Thanks for listening to the Same Day Podcast. Tune in to a new show each week and be sure to subscribe to get future episodes.